Welcome to our Globus office hours. And today we have a special presentation on Globus Connect Server and sharing policies, which Jason Alt, one of our senior developers, is going to do. So Jason, please go ahead.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Next installment of Globus Office Hours. This time we're going to dive into sharing policies, what they do, how they work, and how they interact with other GCS pathing config settings. Now, the sharing policies is just one of a plethora of ways GCS has to control who shares what and with whom. So we're going to dive into sharing policies, but if you're interested in any of those others, feel free to let us know. We'll have a follow-up Globus office hours to drill into those as well. Okay, so let's get started. In a nutshell, sharing policies are used to control what data map collection users can share via their own guest collections. So map collection users may have access to data via the map collection, but sharing policies restrict which subset of that data the user can share with users outside of the organization. It limits which users can share, which of them can do sharing, which storage system paths the user can share, and the permissions they can grant to external users on their own guest collections. Sharing policies are then attached to map collections and affect all guest collections attached to that map collection. And you must have either an endpoint admin role or a map collection admin role to create sharing policies. So the takeaway from the nutshell, sharing policies control who, how, and what data can be shared via guest collections. Here we have an example of creating a sharing policy using the GCS CLI. We're going to go through just how the operations look in the next few slides. Look at the example box in the middle of the screen. That long UUID on the second line, that's the map collection ID. And that's that this sharing policy will be associated with. So in this example policy, only local users Alice and Bob are affected by the policy, and it allows them to grant read and write access via guest collection permissions to anything in /home, but neither user can share anything from /etc. And for a single sharing policy, you can have any number of user values and any number of these path permission values, practically speaking. There's a technical limit, but it's quite large, and you're unlikely to run into it. And finally, we can create any number of sharing policies for a specific map collection, and they will be effectively combined at runtime to determine a given user's sharing restrictions. All right, so likewise, we have a list operation. We have, in this example, listing the existing shared policies for a specific map collection. Again, in the example, that long UUID you see on the second line, that's the map collection ID that these sharing policies are associated with. And below that is existing sharing policies for the map collection. Notice that I truncated the first two fields in the table output from the command, but that's just there to keep this output legible for the presentation. Normally those values are fully displayed. But the other columns with the sharing path restrictions and user fields, those, as they grow larger, will be truncated in normal output, and you'll see them followed by an ellipse when that happens. And just a note for later on in the discussion, if you take a look at that first line of the table output, the line with the null users value, we're going to circle back and I'll explain that later. You can show a specific policy using the GCS CLI subcommand to view details about the policy. And it displays the same information as with sharing policy list that we saw on the previous slide, but without any truncating values. So the show operation takes the sharing policy ID, and that's in the example, that's the UUID you see in the second row in the command box, instead of the map collection ID in the previous slides. And just for note, not to throw anybody off, but in the command output in this example, The values for sharing path restrictions don't normally look like that. They wrap around in a continuous line, but I want them to be legible. I want you to be able to read them in the presentation, but don't be shocked when you use this from command line in real life. And finally, of course, you can delete sharing policy IDs. It's not a shocker. All right. So there are these three variable substitutions that are performed at runtime when we're trying to apply sharing policies to decide what users of map collections can share or not. And you can make use of these three variables to generalize pathing values. And those three variables are $user, tilde, and $home. And $user, looking at the example box here, will be substituted with the current map collection user's local username. So if Alice were setting permissions on a guest collection, for example, that she owns, and this example policy will allow her to grant read permission to /project/Alice to external users of her guest collection. Likewise, if the same rule is in effect and user Bob is creating guest collection permissions, he'd be able to grant read access to /project/Bob. And that way you can write fewer path descriptions using the variable and have it cover multiple users. The tilde and $home variables behave just as you'd expect them if you were using them in a bash shell. GCS will substitute the current user's home directory. However, there is one little gotcha here, and that's that tilde and $home, they're only usable in sharing policies assigned to map collections where the map collection's base path is /. All right, so if you're trying to create sharing policies on map collections where the base path is not root, GCS will reject the sharing policy and give you a nice little note saying, no, you can't do this. You have to use rewrite the path config without using those variables. The user values use connector specific usernames. When you use these as sharing policy, you need to match the username specific to which GCS connector that is in use by that map collection. So for instance, in these previous examples, I've been mimicking the POSIX connector expected usernames like Bob and Alice. But if you were to create a sharing policy for a map collection attached to a storage gateway that's controlled by a Google Drive connector, then you would expect these usernames to be more like you would email addresses. So in this example, you'd use the user being bob@globus.org. In both these cases, the user values, they're really the target of whatever identity mapping you're performing on the storage gateway. So same format you would use there. All right, so in the next few slides, we'll discuss how path values interoperate with the other GCS path configs, which may be a point for confusion for some admins if they're not certain if the two path values are additive or not. In the case of map collections base path, it is independent of the path values used by the sharing policy, except for one little notable exception with respect to the tilde and $home variables, which we just discussed, which can only be used with map collections whose base path is not root. But to put it short, both the map collections base path and the sharing policy path are expected to be relative to the root of the storage system. So always be relative to /. Restrict paths and sharing policy paths are independent. Both are expected to be rooted at the storage gateway root as well. However, restrict paths does have implications worth discussing for sharing policies. Restrict paths are set on the storage gateway, and they limit access on the map collection to specific paths. So they limit access to what and how, but not who. So there's no user value, just path and permission controls, right? And those are on the storage gateway to control what map collection users can access, as opposed to sharing policies which control what those users can share. If you use both restrict paths and sharing policies, restrict paths will take priority over the values set on the sharing policies. And this makes sense if you consider that guest collections cannot share data the owner of the guest collection does not have access to. So at the bottom of the page, there's an example. If you were to create sharing policies to allow read-write sharing of temp, but there is an existing restrict path setting that restricts users' temp access to read only, the guest collection will not be able to allow read access to temp. Write access to temp. The sharing policies, write permissions on temp are ignored because of the restrict path settings. Okay, so in that way, restrict paths always trumps sharing policies. Sharing restrict paths, not to be confused with sharing policies that we're discussing today, is or was a legacy way of restricting sharing from a map collection. It's similar to sharing policies, except it is limited to paths and permissions, and it's not tied to specific users. So it only restricts what and how, but not who. And the setting for sharing restrict paths applies to all map collection users. You can view its current config from the command, the GCS CLI sharing policy list command, which we looked at earlier. And if you remember, it was listed as the first policy, and it was one with the user's value set to null. So I'm going to go ahead. Let's go back. Where was it? Right here. So that first line back here with the users equal null, that's the one that's the sharing restrict paths. Okay. Now, gotta remember where I was. All right. So what happens when you have overlapping paths? This is probably the most complicated question. So you can create multiple sharing policies per map collection. You can have multiple paths configs per sharing policies. What happens when you have duplicates or you have overlapping path configs that apply to the same users, the same paths in between sharing policies? Well, in this case, you can make use of this handy cheat sheet table, which is snipped from our GCS public documentation. And there's a link at the end of the presentation to determine how these are combined. So for example, you'd use this table. Looking at from left to right, you have the shorter path column, you have the longer path and result. So if you grant a user read access, but the path that user is accessing has a longer setting path config in sharing policies that has read-write access, then the third column is the result. Okay, so even though an earlier path setting only allowed read, the longer path setting allows read-write, the result is that they get read-write access to that longer path. Right. More interesting one is probably you go down to the third one. If you have a shorter path and you grant a user read-write, but they're accessing a subdirectory of that, and that longer path has its own setting, which restricts to read, the result then is read-write that they'll have access to. I hope that's clear. And if not, you can always ask questions and send email to support@globus.org. And that is it. Here's some useful references for further information.